This is the story of 3 kittens and the mother cat who were owned, or rather kept, by an old lady called Mrs. Cope. Mrs. Cope and her cats lived by themselves in an old run-down house and a big overgrown garden. Both the house and garden were getting far too much for Mrs. Cope to cope with. She'd been a widow for many years and had been in poor health for quite some time. Every now and then, when she tried to look after the house or garden, Mrs. Cope would become short of breath, her head would start to ache, and she'd have to go inside and take a tablet. Then she'd have to go and lie down on her bed for the rest of the afternoon. Mary, the mother cat, who always followed Mrs. Cope around, was often quite worried about her. But after a good rest, Mrs. Cope always managed to get up and make an evening meal for the cats and herself, and everything seemed all right again.
Airstream ahead of it. We've had cool south to southwesterlies for most of the day today, and they'll freshen up as this cold front comes through tomorrow. Temperatures today are generally less than 20 degrees in the southern half of the state, but low 20s through most of the north, also here around Melbourne and through the Gippsland coastal regions.
But it was still glorious summer in the big overgrown garden where Mary and her 3 kittens could run and chase and climb and wrestle all day long. There was Roger, a tabby, and Marmalade Sam, who were always up to all sorts of mischief. Any time there was any trouble going on, they were sure to be involved somehow. And there was little white Pamela too, who would seem so small and frail and delicate one moment, then run off and wrestle with one of the boys and give just as good as she got the next. Mary was fully occupied looking after them all and seeing that no one came to any serious harm. Sometimes it seemed that summer would never end, but it did. One morning, several hours after their usual breakfast time, Mary and her kittens still waited on the back porch to be fed. It was almost midday, and still there was no sight or sound of Mrs. Cope, when finally Mary decided to go and investigate for herself. The whole house was unusually cold and dark inside, and Mary, growing more alarmed with every moment, made her way up the hallway towards the main bedroom. There she saw that Mrs. Cope now lay very still and silent in her bed. Meanwhile, the hungry and curious kittens who had followed Mary into the house were now going their own different ways and following their own inclinations. But Mary couldn't yet understand that Mrs. Cope was dead. Surely she must be in some kind of very deep sleep from which she would soon wake up. She simply couldn't believe that the old lady who had kept and fed and sheltered her since she herself was a kitten could now never do so again. All the rest of the day, Mary stayed with Mrs. Cope in her bedroom, hoping desperately that the old lady would get up by herself or that someone else would come along and help her to wake up. But by late afternoon, whilst the unknowing world passed by outside and Mrs. Cope still slept on, poor Mary, in despair, finally broke down and began to cry and cry and cry.
Mrs. Cope? Mrs. Cope? Everywhere. The smell hits you before you walk in the door. I called the animal people myself. No use waiting for the council. The sooner the whole lot's cleared out, the better.
It was 2 days after Mrs. Cope's death, and although none of the cats had yet got used to never seeing her again, someone had been in to feed them, and Summer seemed to have returned briefly that afternoon when fresh disaster struck. Pam, who knew something was wrong at once, ran off and tried to hide, so Sam, who was always a bit slow and seemed to have been made more so by the heat of the sun, was the first to be caught. Mary, who should have been on the alert, but whose senses were numbed by all that had happened over the past days, was also easily taken. Pam, unfortunately for her, had run off into the laundry and was huddled in a corner from which there was no escape. Only Roger, who was well placed and fast enough to avoid capture, got away scot-free. And what a chase he led the invader! Between trees, through bushes, under and over branches, they seemed to race into almost every corner of the backyard. But Roger had the distinct advantages of being very small, very fast, and very hard to see. And of course, he knew every bit of his own backyard. Every leaf, every twig, every blade of grass, and more to the point, what they concealed. Roger had evaded the invader and undoubtedly won. But the other cats, although pleased for Roger and probably a bit envious of him, were feeling far from happy themselves. Sam tried to comfort his mother with a reassuring paw, but only moments later their cages were wrenched apart and he never got another chance to comfort her again. Then the captives were jolted up their own driveway, out their own front gate, and put into the back of the invader's van. Imprisoned in their cramped cages in the back of this large, noisy, frightening vehicle, the three cats crouched miserable and terrified as they were driven away from the home they had known all their lives but were now never to see again. Roger waited for several hours after his mother, brother and sister had been captured and taken away before creeping out from his hiding place in the backyard. Everything was still and silent around the house. There was no one about at all, and even worse, no supper. After wishing and hoping and hanging around for quite a while, Roger got tired of waiting and decided that if the supper wasn't going to come to him, then he must go out in search of it. Meanwhile, back in the cat prison, for no one could honestly have called it anything else, Pam and Sam were each exploring their separate but adjoining cells, searching for a warm, comfortable spot and any possible means of escape. At least they had some privacy, whereas their poor mother had been put in an open pen she had to share with dozens of other wretched, frightened cats. As far as food and shelter went, it was the law of the jungle, and often only the strongest got what there was. By now, Roger had been wandering around the streets and laneways, searching in vain for some kind of supper for several hours. It was well past nightfall when he was drawn towards a large, brightly lit open building, the like of which he'd never seen before. In spite of all the lights left on, it seemed rather cold and unwelcoming, even vaguely threatening somehow. But here at least, there were no nasty barking creatures, no sight nor sound of anyone at all. So Roger, taking courage in all four paws, at last decided to investigate further. Soon enough, his curiosity was rewarded. For what did Roger's nose lead him to but the long sought-for supper? It wasn't quite the kind of supper Roger had been used to, but he soon found that a little of whatever it was went quite a long way and well and truly filled him up. He was so full that what he felt he needed directly afterwards was a nice warm spot for a good long nap. This place, whatever it was a bit lacking in cosy napping spots, it seemed. The best he could find was a hard wooden bench in a waiting room. But someone had left an old newspaper in the middle of the bench, and as Roger was too tired to explore any further, he decided to make the best of it. And once he was settled down, it didn't seem half bad, and what with all that had happened to him that day, and his Chinese supper, he soon fell into a long, deep, undisturbed sleep. Roger slept so well, he was only roused by low grumbling coming from unhappy-looking people opposite. It seemed to him they'd all been made to get up too early to do something they didn't really want to. Then, just as Roger was wondering what he'd do next, fate stepped in.
Hey look, wonder where he's from.
Bet he's a stray.
Isn't he cute? Aren't you, hey?
He probably wandered off from somewhere.
I don't care. I want to keep him. He's gorgeous.
Come on, we'll be late.
Needless to say, Roger had never been taken on a train ride before. Nor had he tasted the simply scrumptious sardine and tomato sauce sandwiches. Nor yet enjoyed such young, attractive, attentive company. Roger was puzzled by the attitude of all those grumpy people on the platform before. What more did they want? If this was what train rides were all about, then Roger, for one, was all for them. Then, just as he was really starting to enjoy himself, the train stopped, and the girls carried him off, and he was surrounded by more of those awful, grumpy, grumbling people. They were everywhere this time, pushing, shoving, racing to get to places they didn't look like they wanted to get to in the first place. It was a bit of a relief when he was put inside one of the girls' bags, but even in there, he could still hear the confusion outside. He couldn't begin to nap for even a moment. He just had to see what was going on.
My God, where'd he go?
Roger hadn't liked leaving girls like that, but they'd left him in the bag, and at least out here, there were none of those great big... Oh dear. Oh gosh. Well, as he was saying, there were very few of those great big noisy things, and he hoped that was the last of them, because generally, out here was a good deal more peaceful, with no crowds of miserable... Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Roger. 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 It really didn't look like Roger was going to make it that time. Meanwhile, back at the cat prison, things seemed to be looking up a bit for some of the inmates. This was Mavis, a successful self-made businesswoman with an apartment in the city and a weekend hobby farm. And Mavis was in the market for a friendly, low-maintenance cat to keep her company on the farm.
Oh boy, you're a real little live wire, aren't you? You're a real little live wire. Black cats are often a bit delicate, aren't they? Yep, I reckon he'll do. I'll take him.
Roger had been rather lucky in his first few hours on the city streets, but he was just enjoying a recently abandoned, barely half-eaten batch of fish and chips when the city's notoriously changeable weather suddenly changed again. Roger tried to find shelter somewhere, anywhere, but just when he needed it, there didn't seem to be much of it around. And as the storm got worse, poor Roger got soaked through to his skin. If there were too many loving cats, and too little love for them in all the world, there was certainly too little space for them in a cat prison. Only the youngest stood a good chance of adoption, and although Mary was no more than 2 years old, the prison governors had decreed that, as her brief allotted time with them had expired, so too must she. And so, another good cat, faithful companion, and fine mother was no more. This was Martin. Martin was a young man of education, aspiration, and many talents. Perhaps too many talents. On this particular afternoon, Martin had been in a photojournalistic frame of mind when he happened to be driving by the cat prison. So he'd stopped and wandered in and wandered around. But as soon as he saw Pamela, so young, so pretty, so charming and playful and beguiling, well, what else could he do?
Isn't that beautiful? It's pretty eyes.
Seems quiet.
We don't want anything too boisterous. Wonder what sort it is.
Have a look.
A little girl. I thought so. How much did they say they were?
$75.
That's quite a lot, isn't it? Well, she's very nice. But I don't know. What do you think?
It's up to you.
Well, I think I might take her. What about the other one outside? She was nice too. And a bit bigger, wasn't she?
Have another look then. We don't want to bring it back once you've bought it.
No. All right.
Although Martin couldn't quite, and to tell the truth, didn't really want to be able to afford Pamela, he knew he just had to have her. So, he did. Although Pam was complaining when Martin pushed her nose rather too closely into his armpit, everything else he was doing was fine by her. She was only too glad to escape prison, and she sensed that wherever he was taking her now, this was the start of a new, exciting adventure. Roger, who'd found quite a cosy spot to shelter from the passing storm, was just about to jump out when he saw a rather strange-looking chap approaching. Who ratikins was this? And what the devil was he doing?
Bastards. Crap all over the place. How about this? Crap.
hear about this bloody crap all the time. Oh, bloody certain it is.
What a vile-tempered, filthy-clothed, foul-mouthed old man, Roger thought to himself. If there were any more like that around here, he'd be making tracks pretty smartly. But wait, who is this coming down the path now? She didn't look funny or filthy or anything else. Quite young and attractive and nice-looking, in fact.
Oh, hi there. Where'd you spring from, eh? You don't belong around here, do ya? Hey? Do ya?
At last, after all the documentation, injections, and other embarrassing indignities it's best not to mention, Sam was freed from the cat prison and on his way out to Mavis's farm. How much longer till we get there? How much further is it? Sam had been asking, although he was really quite enjoying his ride in the sun and the sight of the blue sky and green paddocks. Are we there yet? Are we here now? Yelled Sam, as Mavis steered their way up the gravel driveway, under a canopy of elms, oaks and cypresses, then up through the gates and into the farmyard itself. At long last, sure enough, they'd arrived. So this was the farm, thought Sam. This was his new home. Well, it didn't look half bad. A bit old-fashioned and run down here and there, perhaps, but he was quite used to that. Quite liked it, in fact. That was historic charm and antique atmosphere, that was. Nothing wrong with that at all. And he was quite sure it would seem even better when Mavis let him out of his cage. And once they were safely inside, with the door shut, she did, and it was. About the same time, Roger was getting to know Melina, who'd rescued him from the cardboard boxes, and her mother Tula, who looked like she wanted to throw him out in them again. Tula was pretty generous with a bowl of milk, though. Did they really expect him to drink all that? Well, he'd have a darn good try anyway. A bit later, not a million miles away, but in a slightly more salubrious part of town, Pamela was getting to know Martin's flat, exploring all the interesting nooks, crannies and lookouts. The top of his wardrobe was easily the best lookout of the lot, and the nice thing about Martin was he didn't seem to mind what you jumped up on as long as you had a good time. And that's just what Pamela was having now for the first time in a long time. A jolly good time.
It is bred and is an inhabitant of almost all countries in the world. All cats were at first wild, but were at length tamed by the industry of mankind. It is a beast of prey, it being, in the opinion of many, nothing but a diminutive lion. It has a broad face, almost like a lion, short ears, large whiskers, shining eyes. It is a neat and cleanly creature, often licking itself and washing its face with its forefeet. A crafty, subtle, watchful animal, yet its greatly inquisitive nature, its great curiosity and quest of novelty, often lure it into situations of great and deadly danger. The best are of a fair and large kind. They usually generate in the winter season, making a great noise. Go 56 days or 8 weeks with young, and bring forth 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more at a time.
A week after he'd arrived at the farm, Mavis let Sam out to explore by himself for the first time. So this was a farmyard, and these funny things with feathers, they'd be chooks, right? At least he'd heard of them before. But what were those huge clod-hopping creatures that Mavis was walking towards? And look, she was actually feeding them now, with grass. Good gosh. And look at this great fat muddy thing making those rude noises all the time. You wouldn't want to get anywhere near that now, would you? Now what good was a thing like that? Incredible that an intelligent, educated woman like Mavis would even think of keeping anything as ugly. And what about this great big fat thing with the curly stick stuck out of the side of its head, chewing and dribbling all the time? Disgusting. Sam found the farm machinery far more to his liking. You could see all over from up there, and if one of those funny farm animals came your way, you could skedaddle quick smart. But what was Mavis up to now, Sam wondered, as he saw her return from the house with a bag of something. Oh, tea time for the chooks. He didn't care much for some of the customers this had attracted either. What a scraggy, scruffy-looking lot, Sam thought to himself, although he didn't dare say so, realizing it wasn't wise to get too personal, because some of them were a good bit bigger than he was, and had very sharp-looking beaks as well. Now there were a better-looking bunch altogether, thought Sam, very friendly too, because now they'd dropped whatever they were doing, and they were coming out to greet him. They were, weren't they? Weren't they? Oh dear. Poor little Sam. He still had an awful lot to learn.
Stop it. Never mind them, love. Never you mind them. Never you mind them, love. Never you mind them. All right now. Everything's all right now, eh?
Roger had settled into Melina's flat, perhaps a little too well for his own good, for no matter what he did or where he went, he always seemed to encounter the Tula problem. Things had gotten so bad that Melina began to fear for Roger's safety if he were left alone with Tula for too long, and she began to take him out with her just about everywhere she went.
Right again?
Only 5 minutes.
What's that?
Oh mine, isn't he cute?
Don't tell me you bring here.
Why not?
Here's the regulation.
I'll leave him out back, he won't be any trouble.
Don't make no difference. He's coming back,
No,
he's
he
in the
won't.
floor, throw
No, he
up or
won't.
something.
Ha! I bet he's a lot cleaner than you are.
What are you talking about?
At least he doesn't stink like you do.
Listen,
If you took a shower more often, you smell less, you know.
Okay, if you bring that here, I call the boss. And I tell you be light. And I tell him about that.
Yeah, go ahead. Call the boss and blab, big mouth.
In his time at the farm, Sam had developed a good working relationship with the other animals based on respect, trust and understanding. If he took the trouble to stay out of their way, they stayed out of his. But this only applied to anything bigger than himself, of course. Anything smaller could jolly well take care of itself. And Sam was just about to sort out a bunch who'd been getting far too cheeky of late. It was Sam's self-appointed job to show them who was boss. All he had to do now was wait for one of the little blighters, just one, to make the first wrong move. Ha ha! Had now settled into Martin's flat and learned that if you had to sum up Martin in one word, well, one of them would have been unpredictable. Occasionally he'd be up at daybreak, mostly he'd sleep in half the morning, but sometimes there'd be a phone call, and then anything at all might happen.
Hello?
Oh, hello, Martin. It's Jane from Action Casting.
Oh, hi there. How are you?
I didn't wake you up, did I?
No.
Martin, I've got a problem with odds and evens. It's an 8-hour call this morning, but someone's let me down. Would you be available?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, that's great, Martin. It's 10 a.m.
sorry,
at
hang on.
Caulfield Racecourse, and you're a racegoer.
10 a.m. Caulfield Racecourse.
Okay?
Right, thanks very much, Jane.
Thanks, Martin. Have a nice day.
Bye. Oh, Christ.
Sam had been on the farm for quite a while when he saw Mavis all dressed up, ready to go out again. He'd learned to avoid the horses, cows and pigs, hidden from the turkeys and geese, tamed the mice. In short, he was getting a tad bored with it all. And there was Mavis, off to somewhere exciting. Why couldn't he go too? Wait for me, yelled Sam as he ran off all the way down to the front fence. Mavis was slowing down as she neared the gate. Surely she must have heard him by now and decided to stop. All he had to do was climb up on the front fence for her to see him. But no, she was driving off without him. Never mind, He'd still show her. He'd take the shortcut through the shrubbery, race out along the hedge, and cut her off on the main road, where she'd have to see him. Where'd she go? Where'd she go? She'd gone. No matter. He'd soon catch her up, and this was far more fun than sitting round with all those other barnyard losers. Meanwhile, thanks to Melina, Roger was now becoming quite a Cafe Society regular. He could be seen sampling the best of Mediterranean cuisine at all hours. In fact, whenever Melina bothered to turn up for work. Volatile was a word for Melina, and although Roger could never complain about being bored, the pace could be pretty hectic most times. You never knew where you were going or where you'd end up from one night to the next.
Meet me new mate.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if I can take him to work, I can bring him here, can't I? Got a drink somewhere? More coffee?
All right.
I'll get something. Wait a minute. Wanna go out? Wanna pee? Hey, baby? Got some newspaper for him?
I'm still reading that.
I'll get you another one.
Roger had quite liked the informal atmosphere of Steve's flat at first, but later on he'd felt himself somewhat unwanted somehow, especially by Steve, and especially after they'd all come in here to the bedroom, where things had gotten decidedly personal. And from the way Steve was carrying on over there now, it looked very much like more of the same was on the agenda. Steve's agenda was no concern of Roger's. Talk about three's a crowd. Talk about odd cat out. Talk about embarrassing. Roger wanted out of there now and out of there fast.
Oh, hang on. Hang on. He wants to get out again. Let me let him out.
I'll let him out.
Steve! Steve! Filthy, rotten, bloody bastard! You've killed him, you bastard!
Oh dear. Well, at least Roger hadn't come to any real harm. And it might have been for the best anyway. But Sam was lost. What had begun as a really fun thing yesterday had turned into a nightmare. He tried doubling back several times, but what with all the twists and turns, become completely bamboozled. He didn't know whether he was coming or going, whether Memphis was up ahead or should that be behind. And now, as if he needed it, here was more aggravation. Sam hadn't seen a dog before. Mavis hadn't had one on the farm, and if this was a fair sample, he was very glad she hadn't. He didn't like the look or sound of it at all. Fortunately, it was too stupid to jump over the fence. Instead, it was trying to wriggle its way through. Ridiculous. Even so, Sam knew he'd feel much better as soon as he'd put as much distance between himself and all that aggression as possible. But Roger was back on the city streets again. Although here, at least, he was his own cat, free to roam where he liked, do what he liked. That was the good bit. The bad bit was there was no more food and no one to feed him. He had to scavenge around all day for whatever disgusting, discarded scraps he could find. Another thing was, he had to be on the alert all the time for any kind of trouble. Sometimes it seemed to Roger that trouble followed him wherever he went. Put one paw wrong and the next moment you were history. Yes, it was a hard life on the streets for Roger. Poor, poor Roger. Sam had wandered many kilometres from the farm when he trudged to the top of a hill and came in sight of a great lake. He'd never seen so much water before. And what about those funny-looking things floating on top? And there were people down there too. And where there were people, there was usually food. Sam had hardly eaten since he'd left the farm, so he was getting pretty hungry. Better get down there and see what he could find. The nearest boat seemed the best place to start, so Sam snuck swiftly towards it. There was no one about, but Sam's trusty little nose had caught the unmistakable whiff of fish. He jumped aboard, and after checking carefully again that there was no one watching, he took a good look inside and another sniff. Yes! Definitely fish in here. Might have been caught a few days ago, but Sam wasn't in the mood to be fussy. Then, just as he was tucking in, oh my gosh, what was that? It seemed to Sam that that was the man who owned the boat, and these were probably his fish. Better keep quiet and finish the fish, no matter what happened. What happened, of course, was that the engine was started, the boat was steered out into the lake, and Stowaway Sam was carried right across to the far side. By the time they got to the middle of the lake, Sam was beginning to feel a bit seasick, or should they be lake sick? Anyway, he was definitely wishing the boat would stop bumping up and down all the time, although those fish he'd just eaten probably hadn't helped. But he was rather glad when the motor stopped and the man jumped out and was hauling the boat to shore. Only then did Sam feel it safe to break cover and very carefully, very sneakily, slink towards the side. Then, quick as a flash, he was over the edge, onto the shore, and up and away into the bush. One day on his wanderings, Roger found a rather unusual place. There were no dogs, no people, and no noise. It was a place where they put cars that didn't go anymore. Cars that didn't move at all, much less try to run you over every time you crossed the road. Pretty soon, Roger realized that this, at last, was the sort of place he'd long been looking for. Now, all he needed to do was to find a nice, cozy, well-hidden spot where he could sleep safe and sound during the day. Surely there'd be some place in here, somewhere, something like that, wouldn't there? Surely that wasn't too much to ask, in a great big place like this, was it? For quite a while, it looked very much like it was. It was late afternoon, and Sam was getting pretty tired of trudging through the bush by now. Although he was no nearer home, he'd come quite a long way in a rather long day, and was just wishing he had somewhere safe to rest when he happened upon a hollow log. And so, as the more conservative 9-to-5ers winged their way home, while more party-minded party animals partied on till all hours, Sam settled down for the night in comparative comfort and contentment in his very own warm, dry, hollow log. Pamela had watched with great interest while Martin prepared for his new part-time job that evening. One of the interesting things about Martin was that he always had a new part-time job. And Pamela, being as smart as she was, just knew it was going to be a fun kind of job. And not very far away either, just around the corner in fact. So why was Pamela sitting home alone when she could be out partying with Martin? The only reason was she'd been locked in. Couldn't get out the front door. Until an unexpected opportunity arose, which Pamela, being the intelligent cat she was, seized with all four of her pretty little paws. She was down the stairs, out the front door, and on her way up the street before anyone was any the wiser. Wasn't this exciting? There'd be lots of scummy food, and she'd be the life and soul of the party. It was true. Blondes always had more fun because they were fun kind of cats. But when Pamela sashayed through the crowd at the door in the most stunning manner imaginable, no one took the slightest notice. It was all a bit disappointing, to say the least. More than disappointing, it was humiliating. Disappointing, humiliating, and frustrating. Very frustrating.
Oh, hello there.
Ha-ha! Now this was more like it. Now things were starting to happen.
I'm sorry about this, but I think that's my cat.
Oh, it's your cat.
She got out. Sorry about that.
Well, that had been more like it at last. Now, what was all this chit-chat about? What were they all talking about and pointing at all the time? Those things up on the walls? They couldn't be... They weren't supposed to be... cats, were they? Unbelievable. No self-respecting cat would ever walk around looking like that. Their mothers would have sat on them at birth. If that was art, include her out. Or rather boring, really. But the nibbles would be nice. Roger had finally found a safe spot in the wrecker's yard, but he still had to return to the streets for food. More often than not, he went hungry, but sometimes he was lucky. Someone had thrown out a whole fried chicken leg. Roger was just tucking in when he suddenly realized he was surrounded by ravenous cats, and they all looked bigger and stronger than he did. Roger called their bluff while he gulped down as much of the meat as he could manage, then decided that half a chicken leg wasn't really worth losing an eye over, and fled. That was life on the streets for Roger.
So what am I doing? Waitering. You're asking yourself, aren't you? Wasting time for the sake of a pittance. The same as I do when I'm off emergency teaching or film extraing. All that other crap. I should be up here creating. Shouldn't I? Creating plays, poems, stories, years of work. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. Not even you, do you? Do you know I'll be 30 in a few months? 30. That's over 100 if I were a pussycat. 100 years old. What's achieved? What's to show for it?
Roger was getting tired of being beaten up by other cats, so he changed his routine. He'd be up by mid-morning, sneak out the back of the wrecker's yard, dodge past the maniac guard dogs in the builder's yard and the maniac drivers on the main road, and run down to some factories where he'd learned you could find food scraps without encountering other cats as much. One particular morning, Roger saw a lady he'd seen several times before, but he'd learned to be very wary of strangers, particularly strangers bearing gifts. You could never be sure why they were giving them or what was in them. Some people tried to poison strays. Others lured them close, then hit or kicked or threw things. People could be cruel as well as kind, and you mightn't find out what sort they were until it was too late.
Hey, puss, 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 puss. Hey, puss, 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 puss. Hey, puss, 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 puss.
So Roger was always very careful, and only when he was quite sure that it was quite safe did he break cover and take a closer look at what was being offered. This morning had been one of Martin's getting up early mornings. He got up a good, half hour before he had to leave. Pamela was quite astonished. He was wearing a shirt and a tie and a jacket. He looked like he'd got a proper job at last, a regular 9-to-5er. And wonder of wonders, he was even carrying a briefcase. Talk about impressive! She knew him better by now, of course, knew it would never last, but had to admire his effort anyway. Ah, well, she'd better do the right thing and see him off, see that he got up to the station on time and caught the right train going the right way. No, that wasn't him. Oh, where had he got to now? Oh dear. Ah, there he was. Cheerio! Try to have a nice day. Don't work too hard and hurry home, she called out, hoping he could hear her above the noise of the train. But once he'd gone, Pamela felt at a bit of a loose end. She didn't feel like going back to bed now that she was up and about, so to speak. What she really felt like, she soon decided, was a nice leisurely stroll to the end of the veranda roof to see what she could see down in the main street. And when she got there, she saw something rather unusual. A vehicle with a nice soft mattress on top. What a coincidence! What a contrivance! Whatever it was, Pamela wasn't going to pass up a chance like that. Now she could watch the fashionable throng face to face. Even better, she could get down and stroll with them herself. Why not? And wasn't sliding down a windscreen rather fun? It was something new and different anyway. Towards the end of the day, Sam wandered in sight of a small stream. He wanted to cross it and could probably have leapt it if he'd had more energy, but just then it seemed too wide to leap, and Sam hated getting wet. So he decided to follow the stream further along until he could find a narrower spot to cross. But the stream only became wider, and Sam soon realized he'd have been better off trying to cross where he started out. That was way back uphill though, and he was getting wearier all the time. It seemed easier to keep on going the way he was. There were small waterfalls and wider, shallower pools, but still no dry crossing spot. Now he could also hear the sound of larger falls only a little way ahead. At last, he came in sight of them, and they were bigger, wider, and more dangerous looking than he'd supposed. But here, a tree branch had fallen across the creek. It wasn't very thick, but it looked strong enough to cross on. Sam knew that if he lost balance, he'd be swept over the falls and drowned, but the slim, slippery branch was his only chance. It was nearly midnight when Pamela heard the last train clattering into the station above her. Once more she ran down the alleyway towards the station ramp to meet the passengers, her tail rising with expectation. There was still no sign of Martin, though. Oh, where could he be? He'd often stayed out late before, of course, but now she was locked out too. The van she'd jumped onto to get down from the roof had long since been driven away. She'd had no food, no warmth, and nowhere to sleep since early that morning. And now it was getting colder all the time. Pam was trudging back along the alley, wondering where she could go and what she should do next, when suddenly...
Puss. Puss. Have a look at this. Come on. Minced steak. Lovely, that is.
Lovely grub, hey? Come on, Pussy. Hey, Puss. Come on. Quick now. Gotcha, you little bitch.
Poor defenseless little Pamela. What horrible fate was about to befall her? Just after dawn, the battered station wagon driven by the seedy criminal who had kidnapped Pam and the other cats finally arrived at a remote location with its feline cargo. The motley collection of waifs, strays and family pets, still shocked by their capture, had also endured a long, hard, bone-jolting journey that had left most of them, now, in a state of abject fear, dejection and degradation. But things were looking up for Roger. These days, he was out of bed every morning about 8, then past the dogs, over the busy road, down to the factory, right on time when Miss Webb arrived for work. Then, it was only a short wait before she came out with his breakfast. Usually, the most delicious diced beef and a saucerful of milk. Roger was onto a good thing here, and he knew it. No such luck for Sam, but after all his time in the bush, he'd learned to develop his natural hunting skills quite a bit. He'd had to if he was going to survive. Rabbits were a bit different and a bit of a challenge, though. There weren't all that many to start with, and even when he caught sight of them, they could race off faster, or almost as fast, as he could. And then again, they often cheated and hid away in long grass or prickly bushes or down their burrows. And even if he caught up with them, they were almost as big and strong as he was. It was all a bit unsporting, really. Sometimes, however, Sam was lucky, which was just as well, because there was no one out here to feed him. Fresh rabbit off the road, eh? A pity there was no one to skin and burn and slice it up for him either. Still, for some reason or other, someone, somewhere, at some time, had decreed that you couldn't have everything. You just had to be grateful for what you could get. And like it. A half hour after they arrived at their destination, the cats were roused again by the sounds of vehicles passing close by them on the roughly gravelled track. They seemed to halt nearby. Then came the sounds of car doors and hatches opening, and then, most frightening of all, the sharp, vicious, excited yapping of packs of hounds as they were let loose from their trailers and exercised and paraded around the track. Then came the hard, metallic ring and echo as the mechanisms of the starting boxes and mechanical lures surrounding the tracks were tried out. And then, Pamela and her fellow captives' living nightmare really began.
Come on.
Look out, cops! Get in camp down the back creek. Late one afternoon, Sam came in sight of something unexpected. A ruined, almost roofless cottage standing in the middle of an open paddock. It wasn't often that Sam was lucky enough to find proper shelter. He usually had to make do with sleeping in logs or trees or under bushes. So when he found something like this, he knew it was worth taking a closer look at. There wasn't a lot left of the roof, but the walls looked solid, and there was an old mattress and loose hay everywhere, and even better, one or two bales that looked like they'd be good spots to sleep on. Sam's nose detected something else apart from the hay and cattle and decaying timber. The distinctive smell of at least one other living inhabitant, lurking somewhere, nearby, quite close, not very far away at all. Ah well, Mr. Rat would keep. If he had any sense, he'd make himself scarce while Sam was here, for Sam had decided that this was an ideal spot to spend the night, especially with the prospect of Mr. Rat for breakfast. With these happy thoughts, Sam soon fell into a long, deep, untroubled sleep. It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning, and Roger somehow sensed something different, something joyous in the air from the moment he got up. Why, even the builder's yard dogs were only half-heartedly vicious, almost cheerful really, and as he skipped through the gaps in the traffic, the drivers seemed to slow down and toot him happily on his way. There was something different, too, about Miss Webb when she arrived with his breakfast, although it wasn't hard to pick out what it was. She was carrying a large cage, which he set down and opened before unwrapping his diced beef and laying the beef directly in front of the cage. Although Roger was a tad disconcerted by the cage, the beef was every bit as good as ever, even a bit more so. It was this happy frame of mind that probably made Roger less suspicious than usual and pricked his curiosity. As the cage was standing there open like that, he decided to step inside and see what it was like, just for a moment.
Oh, very good, sweetie. Good boy. Yes.
A whole day and a night had passed since Pamela and the other cats had been dumped and abandoned. Their cage had first caught on a sapling about 3/4 of the way down the slope, and the cats had had to spend the whole night trapped upside down with nothing but the wire mesh for support. Towards morning, however, the cage had tipped again and rolled the rest of the way downhill to the edge of a creek. This action had broken open the wire door so that now, at last, the cats were free. Still in varying stages of shock at their long confinement and sudden release, they ran off in all directions into the bush. Only Pamela at first seemed too disorientated to follow. But after a while, she'd gathered her thoughts together and begun to make her way slowly uphill until she found herself in a wide, open, sunny, but rather swampy field. Pam had no other immediate plan than to try to find a warm, dry, sheltered spot somewhere. So she wandered on, still shaken and bewildered by the tumultuous events she'd suffered over the past few days. It had been the longest, soundest, most satisfying sleep that Sam had had since he'd left the farm, and it was only broken by certain squeaking and rustling sounds. Surely it couldn't be, Sam thought groggily, only very reluctantly rousing himself. Surely no rat in its right mind would run round and deliberately disturb him after the fright he'd given it the night before. But, it seemed, he could, he would, and he was. Sam was mad. Fighting mad. All right then. If it was a fight this rodent wanted, it was a fight he was going to get. Rather tasty rat, as rats went, and in the cottage too, Sam had slept quite content. But getting home to Mavis was what he'd set his heart on, and so, without more ado, he knew he'd better get a start on. Roger had learned that Sunday mornings were always the worst times at Miss Webb's. She got up as early as she did every working day of the week and made herself breakfast while she spooned him out more of that dreadful generic cat food she now fed him. What had happened to the delicious diced beef of times past, Roger wondered. Then, after breakfast, the cleaning frenzy began. He was kicked out of his bed while she mopped the laundry floor, but there seemed to be nowhere else he was allowed to go. He was shooed off the lounge chairs, mopped off the lino in the kitchen. Even the carpet itself seemed to be out of bounds once she started hoovering in the hall. It seemed there was no space beyond the laundry where he was allowed to rest. It was a relief to be picked up and dropped back into the boredom of his bed. Pam had had nothing to eat and only dewdrops to drink for several days. She was getting desperate for food, and now she was using up what little energy she had left in hopeless pursuit of any wildlife she could find. Her efforts weren't entirely wasted, however, for now she could see houses just across the creek, and there were people in the playground directly below. The houses and the people made her feel she might be somewhere near her home. What if she were to go over there, across the creek, and ask some of those people for some help? They might be able to help her find a way home, and they might even have some food for her. You never knew until you went over and tried and asked. There went old Crabby Clogs off for the day, and in no better mood than usual, thought Roger, as he heard Miss Webb go out. That loose latch on the laundry door was a bit of luck, though, and Roger, no slacker when he saw the chance, was out of bed and out the door before Miss Webb was halfway up the drive. Ha-ha! Freedom at last! Well, a bit of freedom anyway. Pity he couldn't get right outside, but for once at least, he'd be able to sharpen his claws in the lounge, climb up on the chairs and tables, in short, have a bit of a lark around before old Grumpy Bum got back. The kitchen was probably the most interesting spot of the lot, because that's where the food was kept. But what about that open drawer? Now, that was interesting. There might be some food inside, or some dark spot to crawl into and explore. It was definitely worth a good close look anyway. Right at the back of the drawer, Roger saw a chink of light, so he wriggled over the end, slid down inside the wall, and fell right through under the floor. Wacko, thought Roger. This was living! And quick as a flash, he was outside and over the fence.
Can't we keep her?
We have to find out if anyone owns her. We can't take her if she already has a home.
I hope not.
Roger was out enjoying his morning walk in the sun and fresh air with no particular place to go when he came to a very busy road. Roger was a bit of an expert at busy roads, but he didn't feel like crossing one just then, and he didn't want to turn back either. But there was a big drain pipe just down there beside the road. Now that looked interesting. Why not have a look in there and see where it might lead? Where it led was right under the road and into the park opposite, which was all very well, but how to get out of the drain into the park? Roger ran that way and this, and eventually found a smaller drain leading off the main one. Could be a goer, thought Roger, as he wiggled and wriggled his way down the narrow pipe, only to find that it ran out of a rocky waterfall a long, long way below. No way, no chance, no road, no go back, start again, which was just what Roger did, wriggling his way down into the main drain and then running back and forth this way and that until he happened upon another small drain with light at the other end. Well, let's see where this leads. Ha-ha, 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 ha-ha. Well, this was more like it. And quite picturesque too. Roger went for a nice leisurely stroll along the bank of the creek, looking at the leaves and various other things floating along in the water, and thanking his lucky stars he hadn't fallen in. And then, only a little way further along, he caught sight of a large black plastic bag blowing about rather ominously in the breeze. Whatever was inside that? Roger asked himself. He didn't have long to wait to find out, for the next moment a nose, and then a paw, and then a small white furry head poked out from the bag. It was a 6-week-old kitten, and it was followed by 2 others. It seemed that some cruel person who didn't like or want cats had put them in the bag and thrown it into the creek, hoping they'd be drowned. Only by chance, the bag had snagged on the bank, and the kittens had somehow managed to struggle ashore, still trapped in the bag. The wind had eventually freed them, just as Roger had come along and found them. But to the kittens, it seemed that Roger, and Roger alone, had rescued them. They could hardly wait to shower him with their thanks. Roger, who was quite puzzled and a bit embarrassed by this, raced off up the bank at first, but the kittens chased after him as fast as they could, and Roger, once he saw how happy and grateful they were, hadn't the heart to abandon them, so he waited quite patiently until even the smallest of the lot had caught up with him, then led all 3 of them off for a day of fun and play in the park. Natalie and her mother had spent the afternoon door knocking at almost every house around the playground, but of course no one had ever seen or heard of Pamela before. After doing all that, they decided to take her home, which was fine by Pam, because from what she'd seen of Natalie and her mum so far, she thought they'd all get on very well. Of course, inside the house, there were so many unfamiliar sights and smells, and it all seemed so strange and different that Pam felt quite overwhelmed at first and had to crawl under Natalie's bed and have a good lie down, just to get used to it all. She'd be all right in a little while, once she got her bearings. And Natalie seemed to know and understand this, and that was all that mattered, really. Sam had come in sight of a big, wide river. It was a river he knew he had to cross if he were ever to get home again. If only he'd been able to fly like the birds. But he couldn't, so he wandered downhill and followed the course of the river along its banks in hopes of finding some way of getting across. To get a better look out, he climbed up into the branches of a wattle which overhung the bank, but then became distracted by the sight of a pair of pelicans. Then it happened. The frail, worm-eaten branch snapped under Sam's weight, and he fell into the deep and muddy waters. Sam surfaced only a short way from the steep bank, and was surprised to find that he could swim, and swim quite well. The trouble was, he got caught up in a strong current that pulled him into the centre of the river, and he began to be swept downstream. Although Sam swam quite strongly, he knew he couldn't keep going for more than a few minutes before he became exhausted. By good luck, however, the course of the river twisted a little, and Sam was swept aside into an eddy. Fighting free of it, he summoned all his remaining strength and paddled furiously for the closest bit of riverbank. With more effort than he'd ever put into anything in his life before, Sam threw himself through the water towards the shallows. He clawed hold of a partly submerged branch, clambered up over this, then hauled himself up onto dry land. Stout-hearted Sam had swum the river and survived. Wasn't this fun then? There were people out strolling and cycling and kicking things about. Not so sure about those big hairy things with the wagging tails, though. There was only one thing missing, and Roger saw it. Someone had left a half-eaten ice cream on a bench, and Roger wasn't going to hang around waiting while they came back for it. The kittens weren't slow in following his lead, and a perfect afternoon was now complete. But Sam was hungry again, and the rabbit he was after seemed older and slower than the rest. Sam knew if he could only run a little bit faster and cut him off, he'd have him when... In the excitement of the chase, Sam hadn't seen the rusty old rabbit trap in the long grass. All that morning, Sam writhed around in agony and frustration. He yelled so loudly, it was a wonder one of the drivers on the road above didn't hear him and stopped to help. But it wasn't a very busy road, and they all went by so fast that they didn't seem to take any notice at all. And as the sun got hotter, Sam got thirstier and wished he could get close enough to the creek to lap up some water. At sunset, although the pain in Sam's leg had eased a bit, some of the rabbits reappeared and seemed to take delight in grazing so close by that Sam was certain they were mocking him while they munched. Roger's day out was over, and it was time to farewell his newfound friends. He knew he couldn't take them home with him, but that they'd find someone to care for them in the park. "Bye-bye," they yelled as they watched anxiously while he crossed the busy road. By the time he finally found his way back home, however, it was well after dark, and there was precious little sign of a welcome of any kind from Miss Webb.
Oh, where have you been? I don't know how you got out, but there's no dinner for you tonight.
Well, if there was no dinner, there wasn't much point in him staying in, was there? Roger reasoned, and decided to do something about it.
what you've been up to. Now that's shut up, that's shut up, that's shut up, and you're shut up.
For Pamela, the living was easy now. Not so for Roger, though. He could get up whenever he liked, but there wasn't much point because there was nowhere for him to go when he did. But Pamela was a bit spoiled. She got out of bed when she was good and ready, and whenever that was, breakfast was always there waiting. But Roger had found that, as breakfast was nothing to get excited about, it was hardly worth bothering at all. After breakfast, Pamela could lay out in the garden under the trees, and quite often there'd be lots of interesting things going on up in the trees. Things that made it quite worthwhile climbing up and having a much closer look at. All else failed, there was also that cheeky stuck-up Burmese from 2 doors down who sometimes wandered in. She had to be taken care of too. But Sam was still trapped down by the creek. His leg had kept him awake most of the night, but when he first heard the car approach, because it seemed to be travelling slowly, he thought perhaps it might be someone come to help. Instead, it was only someone who had thrown away their lighted cigarette so that it landed in dry grass just near where Sam lay. The cigarette smouldered at first. Then a sudden breeze ignited it into a small spot fire which spread so rapidly that in less than a minute Sam was half encircled by an arc of flame. The flames blazed higher and burned closer to Sam, and he tried again to chew through the chain on the trap until the choking, blinding smoke forced him to roll away just to keep breathing. But the smoke clouds drifting over the road alerted a farmer as he drove across the bridge. He pulled his truck over to one side and climbed out to have a look at the fire. As he walked back over the bridge, he began to hear Sam's cries, then saw him almost smothered by clouds of smoke, and then raced into action.
Gardens and undercover parking at the front are some of the exceptional features offered here. These 1 or 2 bedrooms...
Although Natalie's mother had only just realised it, Pamela herself was soon to become a mother. She was eating more and more at mealtimes, and even between meals, whenever there was a chance of a little bit extra, she'd be out there ready and waiting.
The streets are curved and tree-lined, while the blocks are wide and deep with a seven and hedge garden. This particular block is nearly 30 meters like the street, and the impressive triple house is well dated.
Hello?
Is that Mrs. Kay?
Yes.
Oh, good evening, Mrs. Kay. I'm calling on behalf of Allied Market Research.
Oh, yes.
We're currently doing a survey in your area, and I wonder if I might take a minute to ask you a few questions about particular brands of cleaning products you might use about the house.
Mm-hmm.
If you're happy to cooperate with the survey, you'll receive a free sample pack of our client's products.
I'm sorry. I'll have to go now. Yes, I'm sorry. Goodbye. Pamela, get away from that. Come on, get out of it. Get out of it, you naughty girl. Oh, I know you're young and you like to get out and about and have your nights on the tiles, but it doesn't do you any good in the long run. You can't keep on burning the candle at both ends, you know. And as much as I love you and want you to stay, I can't have you carrying on as you have been any longer. It's not a decision I've taken lightly. I've thought a lot about it and got the best possible professional advice.
You may think it hard of me now, but later on, in the long run, you'll come to realise it's more of a benefit than anything else.
Sam was in quite poor condition by now, but he still survived. And in spite of his bad leg, and in spite of the small amount of food he was able to catch or scavenge in his semi-crippled state, his months in the bush, without care or attention from anyone, had toughened him up and forced him to develop a special kind of extremely stubborn self-reliance. And now, too, as he trudged in an almost unwaveringly straight line across the countryside, with each extra kilometre that he travelled, he grew more and more certain that he was finally getting closer to his home. Pamela was by now very big with kittens. She knew they'd come along within a few days, and that it was high time to search round for a nest. Would this roll of lino do? Not really. Too narrow, too steep, and they'd all fall out. Well, what about this box then? Too small, not enough room. All right then, what about somewhere inside? What about under the wardrobe, for instance? Maybe. A bit drafty, though. Well, what about one of these drawers? Bottom one was nice and wide, but it was far too full of jumpers, wasn't it? And the top one? No, too high for the kittens. But wait, Natalie and her mum knew just what was wanted and had gone out and got it. But was it quite right? Would it really do? And did it fit the bill perfectly? Pam finally decided that it was, it would, and it did. And then, very early one morning, Natalie was roused by some soft crying sounds coming from the laundry.
Mummy, she started. There's two already. Six now.
6? My goodness. I suppose I should have brought him in sooner, but I didn't realise.
Well, 4 to 5 months is ideal, though we can't have done too much damage yet. Anyway, we'll soon have all those little problems solved. Now, would you mind holding Kitty for a moment, Miss Webb? Just preparing the injection now. Not strictly necessary, of course. Once upon a time, we just whip 'em away and suit yourself, so to speak. Just my little professional jest, of course. Naturally, we do things with far more finesse these days. Now, if you could just hold Kitty nice and steady, we'll have everything off. Oh dear.
Roger was finally free again. Free to run, play, fight, stalk, scavenge, kill or be killed. But free to live. Against all the odds, Sam had survived every obstacle that fate had thrown in his way. And now he was travelling through familiar vineyards and paddocks and heading down towards the old ridge road that he'd been driven along when Mavis had first taken him out to the farm.
Where have you been? You've been all this time, eh? Poor old Sam. Poor old Sam.
Pamela's kittens were only a few days old yet, but they're all strong and healthy, and they all grew very quickly. In a short time, their eyes had opened, and they'd started to crawl out of their basket, and even to stumble about a bit on their wobbly little legs. Of course, some were a bit more advanced than others, and these others, who felt they were being left behind, got a bit miffed by this. But they all caught up in a short time, and very soon everyone was walking, or more likely running, around the house with all the confidence in the world. In no time at all, Pamela had decided that they were big enough to be let out of doors, and they took to having their breakfast with her out in the sun on the patio every morning. After breakfast, and perhaps a very quick wash and lick up, it was out into the garden for some exploring and chasing and wrestling and climbing trees and general running around and having fun. Each kitten's own little adventurous life had just begun.